Hello. Sorry, she said, waving the book. Welcome to the latest AQR webinar, and welcome to Nick Southgate and Nick Chater, who very kindly come on board to discuss Nick C's latest book, this one, The Mind is Flat, which he's just told us has won the US Prose Award for Best Book in Clinical Psychology. So many congratulations for that. Nick Southgate, oh, I can hear echo now, partook of our last webinar. So he's an old hand at this, and he says he's a philosopher turned advertising planner, turned into some sort of hybrid creature via work at the School of Life and the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising. Nick Chater is Professor of Behavioural Science at Warwick Business School, and he's on the advisory board of the Nudge Unit. He also broadcasts regularly on BBC Radio 4, has hundreds of publications under his belt, and runs I meant to ask, what is an MOOC? On the shocking shallowness of human psychology on Future Learn. Anyway, this is about The Mind is Flat, the relevance to qualitative research, so I will leave you to it. Bear with me while I disappear off the screen, hopefully.
And fade to black Llewellyn. So what fades into the background. So Nick, thanks for joining us. And I think I was reflecting on this. It's about 10 years since we first met doing work at the IPA. So and it was very exciting to see you publish your now award-winning book. So all those conversations I never got to finish with you because you were rushing somewhere else, a lot of it was in the book. But what I'm interested in is it strikes me it's quite a personal book in that it's not just built out of your research, but it's built out of your sort of more profound beliefs or your deeper beliefs. So I was just interested to start by asking you how you came to write a book called The Mind is Flat, really. And then we'll get to what you mean by the mind being flat.
Yes, that's a good question. I think it comes from a couple of sources. One is that my starting point in the academic world when I did my PhD was the world of cognitive science, and that's the project of trying to build computer models of the mind. So it's sort of like artificial intelligence. Your aim is to build models that are like people. And a very natural strategy to do that is to think, well, what we need to do is to work out what people's beliefs are, what they know about the world, and also what they like, what they want, what they don't like. So we try and get all this out of people's heads. And then we put it into a computer program and try and figure out what the program would like to do. So it seems like a sensible strategy. And before about sort of 1980 or so, it was probably the most popular strategy in artificial intelligence. I came into the field in, I suppose, about 1986 as a PhD student. So I was in the sort of latter phases of this project. And it was very influential on me to think that when people try to do this, it always seemed to go horribly wrong at the very first stage. So you'd think, I want to know how to play chess, say. I want to make a computer that can play chess. So I need to talk to some grandmasters. I mean, they're really good at chess. They must know loads about this. So they'll just tell me what the strategies they're using are. Then I'll put them into my computer and off it will go. But in fact, it turns out that's a disastrous approach, partly because the grandmasters have no idea what they seem to know. They tell you different things on different days. Most of the time, they just say, well, that's obviously a silly move. You wouldn't want to do that. But they can't really tell you why. But not only that, they also, the things they can tell you turn out to be rapidly to lead to inconsistencies. So they'll tell you a few things. Say, well, a good rule of thumb is X, a good rule of thumb is Y. And then you say, yeah, but wait a minute. But what about this case where they seem to give different answers? And that happens immediately, all the time. And we see this, of course, with ethics. So you think about the general challenges we have with ethics. We're always struggling with things like, well, of course, we want to avoid suffering. That's terrible. We must reduce suffering. But on the other hand, we want to maintain autonomy. So we don't want to find ourselves, so that creates ethical dilemmas where people are extremely ill or suffering terribly. So we don't quite know what to do about that. All of the sort of ethical challenges that we face in our lives are just illustrations of this fact that as soon as we think about anything tricky, we realize, oh no, my beliefs, my preferences, my values, my principles are in contradiction to the extent that I can formulate them at all.
Yeah.
So where that got me to the thinking about the mind is flat, or the title of the mind is flat, is the old sort of artificial intelligence perspective would be your mind. You don't quite know what your beliefs are, you don't quite know what your preferences are and your principles are, but that's sort of whatever's in your head. It's beliefs and principles and preferences and things like that. But there's lots of them, and the more you think about them, the more you think, oh, I've forgotten about this one. Oh, I remember that one. And you can tell a longer and longer story about what these preferences and beliefs are. But I think it's an illusion to think that these stories are actually reflecting what's in your head. What they are is creative enterprises. They're a creative endeavor of you trying to understand yourself in the moment, at the very moment you're thinking, well, why did I make that move? Or why is this wrong, but that's not wrong? Then that's the point at which I'm inventing the story.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying there is that rather than this, so it's in folk psychological terms, we can say comfortably enough, people do have beliefs and preferences and they know things. But the idea that they are somehow stitched together underneath in a coherent or near coherent whole, that seems to be where your suggestion is they don't lie underneath, stitched together. We stitch them together as we go.
Yes.
It's the invention in the moment, because you talk a lot in the book about the improvising mind.
Yes. No, that's exactly right. So I think we should think of ourselves as rather like fictional characters. So again, one of the things that comes up a lot in the book is as analogies with fiction. And I think when we're reading a book, we have a real sense of the depth of the characters and their motivations. And we're not quite sure about all their motivations, but we have a sense that they're sort of deep, interesting, rich things. And indeed, we ourselves are deep, interesting, rich things in a sense. But the sense of depth can't be that inside the head of the character, say Anna Karenina or Sherlock Holmes, there are real beliefs and desires and principles, because of course this is a fictional character. They don't have a brain. They don't have there's nothing inside them. But from the scraps of information we know about that person, we are able ourselves to weave a complicated story about why they did this and why they thought that, and probably they would have done this in a different situation. And we can do that about ourselves too. And I think we can do it for the same reason. So we're observing our own lives flow by. We're observing the people around us. And we understand ourselves in just the way we understand fictional characters or other people, by improvising stories. I think the illusion is thinking, no, when I'm understanding myself, I look inside. There's all this coherent stuff in my head, and I just have a good nose around in my own brain. And I think that's something we just simply can't do at all. And it's sort of we know this. I mean, if you ask me something like, I don't know, for example, why do I buy one thing rather than another thing? So I'm saying, why have I got a particular broadband provider or something? Not terribly like that. I think, you've got me there. Well, I can tell you something historical about what I used to have, and I didn't get on very well with them. And I don't know why I switched to this one, but I can give you a story. And this is not a vacuous story. It's useful stuff to know. But the idea that in a case something like that, something trivial, it's sort of obviously true that we don't have some sort of deep sense of, yes, I've got all the providers and their strengths and weaknesses. No, of course I haven't. I've just got a sort of scrappy understanding. But that scrappy understanding is sort of always like that. I mean, the sense that is, in fact, that we have of being kind of slightly imposters and skating on thin ice as we flow through life. I think all of us know, really, that when we're trying to explain and understand our behaviour, we're kind of very unsure. We're bumbling from one situation to another, and we're really quite good at maintaining the pretense that it's all coherent.
Okay, so what I want to pick up in here, so if you're a qualitative researcher, you sit there in conversation with people, and it is a sort of prevalent belief in the industry that our task, and indeed this is what clients ask us to do, they say, I want to know what is behind their thinking. Now, you've just said there, if you ask the question, like, why did you switch your broadband provider? And someone says, well, I became hugely frustrated with the old one. This is true. They've not said something that's like profoundly false. But your suggestion is that they've not revealed, because we're trying to learn these things to predict things. So I suppose there's two things. So how should we sort of weight what we've discovered there? And what predictive value should we ascribe to it, if any?
Yeah, I think the thing I would stress really is when you're asking someone why they did something, they can quite often tell you, not necessarily all that accurately, but they can tell you something about the history. So what happened, and a little bit about why. Though often that, of course, is in fact latter interpretation. I mean, I suppose I must have been fed up with my broadband provider. Otherwise, why did they change? I may have some memory of service outages or something, but this is likely to be pretty partial, and mostly much of it will be sort of later interpretation. Having said that, that might be quite predictive of my future behaviour. So the sort of superficial sense I have of I don't trust company X, Y, or Z, even if I'm not quite sure why I do. That sense of a company, that company, or any company with a similar name, or any company owned by the same people, or anything just vaguely associated with them, I just don't like it. That's useful information to know.
Yeah.
It's not that there's some sort of deep theory I have, or some really, really coherent set of things that express my sort of deep, true values across all possible situations. It's just a sort of scatter of local experiences and views.
So I think there's something you're touching on there, which I suppose you sort of talked a little bit about this beforehand, that if we ask a question like that, do we maybe learn very little predictively about that individual, but maybe learn something predictively about people in general? So we learn that frustration is a reason for doing something. But broadly, if you reduce frustration in that market, you will keep more customers.
I think that,
I think it's this sort of borrowing from the idea of like a Freudian unconscious, wherever you come to it, that we'd like to think that preferences are deeply internal. I think it's the extent to which when we tell these stories about why we change, they are predictive not only more of other people's behavior than our own, or they're kind of collective tropes that we borrow upon.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of truth in that. I think sometimes first of all, I should stress that I think that qualitative sort of face-to-face conversational interactions, rich interactions with people, are fantastically important if you want to understand anything. So, although my background is experimental research, and I run a co-run a quant consultancy, Decision Technology, which does very quanty things. In reality, you can't get very far without rich engagement with individuals if you want to understand almost anything qualitative researchers care about. So I'm not sort of imagining that there's some alternative strategy, but I think it's probably a mistake to think that what the qualitative research is trying to do is to uncover some sort of hidden belief structure that the person's not really aware of. It's more that you're allowing them to, as it were, create and give you a story about their behavior. If you get several people to do this, you'll suddenly find sort of recurrent patterns and the same things start to come up. And the things that people find persuasive stories are themselves important, because if you're introducing a new product or a new option, a really crucial question is, what story are they going to tell about this? And the answer is not defined. It's not that it's not clear before we start. It's a creative question. So if I introduce the iPhone for the first time, or introduce texting or something, before texting came along, this sounded like a total turkey. It's we already could speak. Now we just going to be typing characters on a terrible keyboard to each other. That's never going to work. But in fact, it turns out there are ways of using the technology which we love. So I think the idea, we all know that there's not so whether people like or dislike something is not something that is kind of fixed in their head before the new product or service or offering comes to them. There's a sort of dynamic, creative process of, are we all going to get our heads around this? Are we going to decide we love it and this is how we're using it, or are we going to just not? And that's just not well determined. Yeah. But qualitative interactions with people and exploring that space with them will be really helpful way of giving you a clue.
So I suppose I was just interested to pick up, have you ever, in your long career in psychology, experimental psychology, used qualitative methods? Is that?
Yes, I have actually, yes.
So what did you use those for? Because I think one of the things that people at the AQR they're used to sort of, as we were talking to Luella before, one of the previous webinars was someone who's written a book called The Focus Group is Dead, right? They're used to that kind of wholesale attack on the very credibility of it. So to talk to someone who holds this apparently sort of heretical view, yet has used qualitative methodologies, it'd be interesting to hear about that.
Yeah. So I mean, I've used it quite a lot. So for example, in pensions choices, we did a project years ago on what people do. What happens when you get to the pensionable age and you can potentially change your annuity You can buy a different annuity from the one that you've got with your current pension provider. Most of us just don't even think about this. We just plow on. We think, well, I'm with whoever I'm with. That's just, and that's really not a good idea. So it's actually relevant to you at some point in the future, any of you. Watch out, because actually you can get, it actually really makes a big difference which provider you're with. Anyway, the question is, why don't people do this, and how can we get them to do it better? And of course, you might want to have a big web-based survey of pensions of different ages and so on. There's sort of quantity sort of approach, and look at different possible ways in which you could persuade people to behave differently, or just get them to explore how they ended up with the pension they ended up with, and all of that stuff. But you can't really get started with knowing what questions to ask without having rich interactions with actual people in a situation. And I think that's just the general story. For quant research, which doesn't start with qual, tends to be pretty hopeless, I think. Because you just don't know what questions you should be asking. So you just miss out something absolutely crucial. And
so that's how, so you wouldn't really want to do a quant, and it used to be the classic methodology. You would never do a quant thing without at least a small pilot, just to test the questions, basically. And and
it's partly to test the questions, and also to test the breadth. So I think the reality of real interaction. Well, another example would be energy. As it's true, most of the big quant projects we do in decision technology do have a qual front end of some kind. Sometimes quite a big one. So things like understanding energy purchasing. So this is all about switching or non-switching in the for the big 6 or whatever it is now utilities. A lot of the factors that people that really are important to people are things that would never cross your mind unless you've had those interactions, which should be obvious to listeners, but it wasn't so obvious to me. So talking to people about their energy, you would find some people who said, I think it's basically part of who I am, that I can keep the house as hot as possible, and I don't want any of this insulation, because I just want to be able to get the much energy going through the house as possible. That's comfort. And you might say, well, that just doesn't make any sense. So surely, heating, more insulation, that's got to be good. But that's not always the way it seems. There's a nanny state perspective. There are all kinds of perspectives on the problem, or indeed just a sense that you don't want to think about it. It's upsetting. The whole issue of energy bills is unpleasant and not a nice thing to think about. And you're worried about it. And the last thing you want to be doing is focusing your mind on this and this disturbing question. So you just don't want to even think about changing your provider or insulating your loft or anything of that kind. But there's this space of possibilities is vast, and people who don't interact in a one-to-one level with other people who are on this question of interest are going to just be picking a few things out of the air which seem like, to a sensible, rational person, a bit like them, seem sensible, but they'll just miss almost everything of interest, I think.
So I think that if people are not getting these, when they express beliefs and preferences, if they're not getting them from within, where do they get them from?
Well, I think they get them from basically 2 places. So one, they're getting them from their own past experiences. There's a little bit of circularity there, of course, because, but nonetheless, it's the case that many of my choices are very much similar to my choices in the past. And also I'm using my past choices to work out what sort of person I actually am. So if I'm thinking tea or coffee in the morning, I often, in fact, won't think much about it at all. I'll just default to tea in the morning, coffee in the afternoon, or whatever it is. But if I try to think carefully about it, so if I imagine sipping my tea and thinking, is this actually nicer than coffee would be? It's just really hard to tell. But you have to do a sort of experiment and test both. We don't. That's not what we're doing. We have the feeling that I must have a desire for tea, but actually, it's much closer, sort of psychologically, to the point that I have a habit for tea. And so that's a lot of our behaviours like that.
So we have habits for which we give reasons, because to have habits with no reasons would seem silly, embarrassing and incoherent.
Yeah, so I've often had the experience of drinking not particularly nice coffee in places like canteens, where I will have a coffee and I'll think, I've done it again. I think of myself as a coffee drinker. So when someone says, "What would you like?" I think, "Oh, I'll have some coffee." But then it comes out of some horrendous machine, and I always think, "Oh, this bears no relation to the thing I actually like." But there I am drinking it, and I do it again and again. It's not. It's based on this. In my case, I suppose, a very superficial.
It's what you do in those circumstances.
Coffee's the thing I tend to respond with.
And I suppose that's very interesting. I think there's some decisions are very context driven. So I don't drink at all and I don't like beer. But if I find myself having to wait for somebody in a pub for a long time, I have a sort of reflexive habit where I'll order a pint of Guinness, because you can sit with a pint of Guinness in a pub forever and no one will trouble you. That seems to be like, so even though I like, you have to drink about a third of it, so then people really won't. They just can't work out how long you've been there and how dangerous you are or whatever. So now that's ridiculous, because I hate the stuff. I don't want to go, like, everything about it is wrong. And yet it's a habit. And I just wonder how much, and that seems to be driven by like where I am, what I have to do. And there's some work there's a book by Steve Sloman called The Knowledge Illusion, which is very much about how we, in a very real sense, store a lot of our apparent beliefs in the outside world. So he used an example, I think it's a Liverpool University sourced paper, about asking people who can ride a bike to draw a bicycle. And it turns out that even people who know how to ride a bicycle, when you ask them to draw one, it's mechanically disastrously inaccurate. And that's because when they go to ride a bicycle, the bike reminds them, as it were, how to ride it. So you don't really need to know. You just need to know enough to be reminded when a bicycle appears before you. So do you sort of ascribing that what we might be, when we're questioning people qualitatively, what we're looking for is to find those context-driven responses where we then sort of create these?
Yes, I think that's right. So the thing about habits is they are completely, they are triggered by the situation we're in. They're triggered by context, and they often are triggered in a fairly superficial way. So the bicycle example is a lovely one. And I mean, in terms of riding a bicycle, you don't have to know much. You have to know sort of roughly where the pedals are and where the seat is and how to get on it. And then you actually have to know some quite complicated balancing stuff, which you've got no conscious awareness of anyway. And sort of off you go. But you don't have to understand the way the gears work and all this complicated stuff. And so, as you say, people have a sense they must understand what a bicycle looks like. It seems obvious, and I ride one every day. I mean, I must be able to draw one, mustn't I? But the answer is not at all. No, and that's going back to the first point about the early cognitive science and artificial intelligence. These are sort of similar examples. There was a famous example about air conditioners, where you ask people, this is in America where everybody has air conditioners. What does an air conditioner do? How does that work then? And of course, none of us have the faintest idea what on earth is going on. But that's a revelation. Most people have a strong sense, similarly as with the bicycle, they have a strong sense that they perfectly well understand this, they know all the details, and they're just going to tell you. But actually, now they start to think about it, it's a bit more complicated than they thought. And I think that's not just true for parts of the physical world, it's true for our attitudes to political parties, our attitudes to companies, our attitudes to deep philosophical questions. But our attitudes for everything are very much like the bicycle. We have a few snippets which we get us by in terms of engaging with whatever this is enough that we can get by in daily life. But if you ask us about deep things, then we're struggling.
Yeah, I suppose I'm a big advocate that the role of a qualitative researcher is one of analysis and interpretation. So it's never just to report what people said, it's to think. And I think one of the things that we have to weigh time and time again is people give you an answer. So you say, do you believe in giving to charity? Which is a very leading question. And they say, yes, of course I believe in giving to charity. And we then have to judge whether they really mean that. It's just a socially acceptable answer, whether that would give any kind of, you'd ask a slightly more nuanced series of questions, but the task is to say whether they mean it or whether they just talk a good game and then never do it. I do quite a lot of work listening to doctors, for example, and you do this thing where they can talk about identifying different types of patient, but if there are only really two kinds of treatment available for mild patients and serious patients, every patient has to be defined as mild or serious. So even though they can describe what an in-between moderate patient might be, for example, they will always reclassify them as mild or serious because there's nothing to do with the moderate patient. They're no use to them. So they can talk for hours about the moderate patient, but it's in a sense empty talk. It's completely sincere, well-meaning talk, but empty in terms of motivation. Do you have any sort of tips about how you would detect in the way people talk about things how to tell sort the wheat from the chaff, or even if you think that's possible at all?
Well, I don't think there's any. I don't think there's any simple way to detect the wheat from the chaff, but I do completely think it's right that one should view the task of qualitative research as an interpretative task. So you, as the qualitative researcher, with the knowledge and sophistication and understanding of people that you have, are the best placed to have a sense of, well, this is the kind of thing everybody says, or this doesn't sound quite sincere, or whatever. There's no sort of methodology that will do better than human judgment on that, I think. I think that's right. So I think sometimes people who aren't keen on the value of qual from the quantitative end sort of think that qual's a bit like quant, but it's just less of it. Complete mistake. It's just totally. Yeah. It's not that if you could only do lots and lots and lots of qual and sort of do lots of statistical analysis of the things that people say and so on, that would be better. I think that's completely mistaken.
I think what's very heartening what you said there is the ability to read other people is a human instinct, or something we can do, and we can maybe hone that and get better at it, and that is incredibly valuable as a research tool.
Yeah, it is.
Even if we don't believe there is this deep mind, there are so many other things we can detect in their usefulness and sincerity.
Yeah, that's right. And so, I mean, the fact that there's no sort of ground truth. There's no ground truth about, am I really pro or anti charity, or do I think giving to charity is good or bad? And the answer is going to be, well, in some situations, I think it is a good idea. In abstractly, I think, of course, charity is very important. People should give to them, and perhaps I ought to give to them. But then in reality, maybe I'm not giving as much as I say I should be. And yet sometimes in particular contexts, I will. And so I will be a jumble, and we're all a jumble. So I think qualitative researchers are all very aware of the sort of richness of this. And I think the task is not to distill it down and think, well, what's really going on with this person? It's more to get a sense of what are the various perspectives and experiences and actions and things that have happened to them that they embody. And it will be a mixture. So I think one thing that I think is particularly useful is getting people to talk about concrete examples, so things they've actually done. Because I think people can spin a good yarn in the general context, which is fairly unconnected to their actual behaviour. If you say charity, good or a bad thing, or it's very good, of course they are, and we can talk at that level of generality forever, but it gets much more specific to me. If you say, when did you last give to charity, and why was that, and what happens if you meet someone in the street with a tin, or what do you feel when people come to your door? When did that last happen? The more situation specific, the better.
Yeah, I think that's it, because actually one of the questions that's come through on the chatter is, do you have any sort of question stratagems? And that would clearly be one to get people to be as concrete as possible and specific as possible. And I think one of the things I sort of that comes up in qual that I always think is interesting is what it's called a FOAF, but a friend of a friend story. And I think those are interesting because they circulate as folklore, but the person they actually happen to, nobody has ever actually met. They're that distant. They have a certain quality that you can say, well, does anyone really take them seriously, or are they scare stories? So you tend to hear them, for example, say about credit card security. Or somebody had their pocket scanned on the tube and they lost thousands. And the actual occasions of this happening are non-existent, but the belief is wide. And so you say, well, when did it actually happen to you? It would be a very good way of shaking out that. And also people then double down, they say it really did happen to them. I think you can kind of tell when they're doing that. Another, so to get some of the questions, because we're sort of heading towards the end of our time, is someone's asked, where in the sort of continuum of modern day psychology would you place yourself? Because the mind of flat does seem, obviously I realise it's the title of a book and it's designed to draw attention to it, but it seems quite a radical position.
Yeah, I think it is. It is. I was driven to write a book. So going back to your very first question, really, because I sort of struggled for all of my academic life with two sort of contradictory feelings. So on the one hand, large amounts of academic psychology and artificial intelligence and many other nearby disciplines basically do assume, and economics for that matter, we have preferences and knowledge, and they're pretty stable. and they wobble around a bit at the edges, as it were, but that's basically the sort of stuff of the mind, these solid beliefs and desires and so on. And yet every time I ever did an experiment, and everybody else, this is true for everybody else in judgment and decision making or social psychology or any other area of cognitive psychology, every time you try and pin down one of these beliefs or desires, it shoots around all over the place and change the context, change the experiment, change the instructions. You just get totally different answers. So the struggle for me was thinking, well, what do I make of this? How do I square this contradiction? And I think ultimately I've broken one way rather than the other. So I've just come to the conclusion that the very idea that there's any bedrock is that's just a fundamental mistake. So this is quite a radical position. So though a lot of the experiments I talk about in the book are quite standard, and indeed some of the explanations I give are quite standard, I don't think there are very many people who are quite taking such a thoroughgoing line as I am and saying, well, actually, it's sort of improvisation all the way down. But I think the reason that is a sustainable view, and this is a sort of breakthrough in my thinking, hopefully productive one, was thinking, well, of course, the thing is that when you're improvising, you can always improvise based on what all the other thoughts you've had before, and also the thoughts you've heard from other people and things they've said and things they've done. So you're not starting from scratch. You've got this incredibly rich tapestry of previous improvisational experiences and thoughts and things to draw on. And that's what's allowing you to create, as it were, the next thought. It's not, so it's always on the surface, it's always constructed in the moment, but every moment can refer back to all those other moments. It's not that you're referring back to a sort of a deeper underlying, this is what I really think and who I really am level. It's more, I'm more like a tradition, the tradition of things that Nick tends to say and do.
Okay, that's it. There's someone's just come with the question. It's very interesting whether we improvise our emotions as well as our beliefs.
Yes. So there's some lovely examples of this. So I'll mention a couple from the book. So I think absolutely the answer is yes. There's a lovely experiment where this is by Dutton and Aaron in 1974. So it's really an old experiment, but a beautiful experiment where they ask attractive female experimenters to interview male bridge crossers. So people are walking across bridges.
I should say this is an experiment from 1971, isn't it? Hence the rather
I think.
Gendered and sort of pre-Me Too era nature of the experiment.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yes. I should stress this. Yes. It would all be done a bit differently now. Careful. But it was so your female experimenters interview the male bridge crossers who are crossing either a high wobbly suspension type bridge on University of British Columbia campus, or they have just crossed a low bridge, which is not scary at all. And the important thing is that the experimenters give the bridge crosser their phone number to say if there are any issues raised by this experiment, which is very unlikely because it's not a very interesting experiment. If you want to, if you need to get back to me with any ethical concerns, here's my number. And of course, quite a lot of the experimenters who are undergraduates on campus do in fact call the experimenters because they're interested in seeing more of them. The exciting prediction that Dutton and Aaron made was that they predicted that there would be higher numbers of phone calls if people had just crossed a high bridge, not a low bridge, and that turns out to be true. So the way the prediction works is you say, well, if you just walked across a high bridge, you're full of adrenaline. When you're full of adrenaline, you're thinking, where's all this adrenaline come from? I've just met this person who's been running me through this experiment. I guess I must kind of like them. I mean, I don't normally have this much adrenaline. It must be because it's because of them. They've caused it. So you have that interpretation of your physiological state of being adrenalized. You interpret that as attraction, and you get this absolutely everywhere. So you get this if you even going back even earlier in psychology if you give people adrenaline shots with a syringe, but you don't. Either you do tell them, I'm going to give you some adrenaline now, or you don't. If you don't tell them, then they have to sit and wait for the experiment to begin, and then they interact with somebody who behaves a bit strangely, and then the person will either be more annoyed than normal by the person's behaviour, or more amused by their behaviour. It depends. Essentially, whatever their behaviour, the person who's in the waiting room with them, whatever they do, the person who's got adrenaline in their body but doesn't realise it, reacts more strongly. But they don't realise that they're reacting more strongly because of the adrenaline, of course. They don't know anything about that. They were so annoying. That person was I couldn't believe how annoying they were. And the reason they think they're so annoying is because the person's behaving a bit irritatingly but I've got lots of adrenaline. So I must be really annoyed about this, because where's the adrenaline coming from? But if you tell people, oh, you're going to feel a bit weird, if it's adrenaline, it's an adrenaline injection, so usually expected to be feel a bit peculiar, then those effects don't completely disappear, but they're much reduced. Because then obviously I think, oh, I'm feeling a bit strange because they told me I would. So I don't misinterpret my emotion. So emotion interpretation is just incredibly rich, incredibly complicated. But it's the key, I think, to take the key take-home message, and I think this is really quite standard perspective in emotion research, is that you shouldn't think of emotions. We shouldn't think of emotions as welling up from within. They're active interpretations. So for what you have access to is your physiological state. I'll know. I've got adrenaline. I haven't got adrenaline. I'm sleepy. I'm wakeful. But I'm then trying to interpret, well, why? Why am I feeling that? And that's where the emotion is being generated.
And is that something where we can learn to, in a sense, create our own emotions? Because I noticed that, despite your clear skepticism for sort of the psychoanalysis of Freud, you speak favourably, I think, of the effects of CBT or other talking cures. You believe those are real, that they can change people's lives for the better. So if they're not changing the deep person, what are they? They're changing the patterns of response.
Yeah, I think what they're doing, I mean, I think actually the virtues of CBT are quite closely connected to the virtues of qualitative research. Actually, you've got to give it purpose, and it's all about rich engagement with other human beings. And one of the things that CBT is doing is, well, I think it's doing two key things. One is it's telling you that the experience and the thoughts you have should not be taken at face value. They're interpretations of the moment. So if you have a feeling of I'm hopeless or I can't succeed, or you shouldn't think, oh, that's my inner self speaking. It's told the real truth. Other people say I'm okay, but I've got the voice from within it. That's the one that's right. That should be treated with great skepticism, because it's just one or more of those improvisations, and you should be able to step back from it and say to yourself, yeah, I improvise that sometimes. Sometimes I come up with other stuff. So that's one sort of point, which is detaching yourself from a sense that there's some sort of gushing inner truth bursting forth, which you just have to take, can be very dangerous if those thoughts are negative. But the other thing is, it's helping you create new habits and new structures and new stories. I think sometimes therapists think of themselves as creating the true story or uncovering the true story, and I would say that's not quite right. It's more like co-creation. We together in this session, as it were, are trying to find a different way of interpreting your life, maybe a more useful one, and one that will help you go forwards.
Okay, Luella, you've reappeared. Does this mean we're out of time? Because someone has just asked actually what would be a brilliant question.
Go ahead.
So someone said, what do you think? I think I remember your answer to this, and I think it was you just burst out laughing, actually. But what do you think of implicit association tests?
Ah, right. Well, I think this is a tricky question, really. I mean, implicit association tests they are very powerful. They are powerful measures of things like of unconscious bias, and I think that's right. Well, the implicitness, I think, is you might think, they're implicit, these association tests, so they must actually, and these therefore they must be contacting your unconscious, and I think that's not the right way to look at it. So I think it is true that we do have certain kind of associative networks between different categories and concepts, which are very fluid and very variable and jump around, but they nonetheless are there, and we're not aware of them. But of course, we're not aware of anything about our minds. We're always improvising in the moment. So I suppose the thing I'd want to say, so I'm not a great skeptic of implicit association tests. I think they are genuinely interesting and useful, but I don't think that what they're not doing is revealing your unconscious in any particular way, because from my point of view, you're never conscious of the inner workings of your brain. Your consciousness just doesn't work that way. All you ever have is a stream of improvisation. And so if I ask you explicitly, what's your attitude to particular people in a particular group, I'll generate some stuff. You might think, well, you must have been conscious of that. But the answer is no. You're conscious of what you've just said. That's true. But you weren't conscious of the processes underneath, and you never are.
Yeah. So you're happy with the association part? It's the implicit part that you have.
It's the implicit. I'm not so sure about. Yes.
Yeah, yes. That claim that you find troubling. Okay. Well, I think regrettably, because as I think I'm proving I could talk to you all day, this time has come to an end, so Luella has appeared to wrap us up. So thank you so much for talking about your book, which I can warmly recommend to anyone. So Luella, to you to wrap us up.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Well, thank you both very much. I mean, it was fascinating, and I apologise for hanging around like a bad smell and not turning my video off. Got there in the end. Just before we say goodbye, I hope to see you at the next webinar. Details will be coming out shortly. And just say, or to remind members that there's just over a week to go before the deadline for paper submissions to AQR's Big Day Out. And 3 other little bits and pieces. There is still a few tickets left for AQR's Not the Christmas Party. Details on the website. There's the new Breakfast Bites coming up. And AQR Spark returns later on in February with Transforming Imposter Syndrome, which sounds fascinating. But again, thank you both very much. And I look forward to a rematch actually at some point, because it seems to be an awful lot that didn't go said. So maybe.
Maybe, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.